Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Chelsea Green Publishing's In Conversation series. We are so excited to welcome Doug Bierend, author of the newly released book, In Search of Mycotopia, Citizen Science, Fungi, Fanatics, and the Untapped Potential of Mushrooms, and Peter McCoy, founder of myco-culture and author of Radical Mycology. The conversation will last 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will turn it over to questions and answers. So please put all of your questions for Doug and Peter into the Q&A box. And I think that we can just get started. So I'll turn it over to Doug and Peter. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Jenna. And
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Peter, for being here. And of course, to Chelsea Green for hosting this conversation and for publishing my book, In Search of Mycotopia. And of course, to everybody who's tuning in. I think this is going to be a very fun conversation, and I'm so happy that you're here. I'll start just by telling you a little bit about who I am. My name is Doug. I'm a freelance writer, journalist, and recently first-time author with my book, In Search of Mycotopia, out now. Over the last 10 years, I've written for various outlets like Wired, Vice, Motherboard, The Atlantic, Outside Magazine, Civil Eats, and The Counter. But my interest for a long time was in science, technology, media, and spaces where I was looking for some hope in the midst of a worsening social, political, and environmental situation that I don't think I need to introduce any of you to. Eventually, I got pretty tired of the discourse around technology and all of the promises of a better world that ended up becoming limited by the same systems and attitudes that have caused many of our problems in the first place. At the same time, quite unexpectedly, I began to find my way into fascination with fungi and became more involved in the many communities that are forming around them. I've since become fascinated by how fungi can play roles in fostering community, along with fostering deeper senses for and understanding of and respect for and relationships to the natural world, and how that relationship is crucial to any work that we will actually help us realize a better future. In short, I don't think that mushrooms can save us or solve our problems for us, but I think they can inspire us to confront our problems ourselves. And that leads me to my guest this evening, who has done so much to show us what's possible with fungi and in partnering with fungi. And I'd like to turn it over to Peter to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and thanks everybody at Chelsea Green, and thanks everybody for joining. I just briefly got into mycology as a teenager. At the time, I knew nothing, had been taught nothing from anybody, and was self-taught or taught myself. Initially, cultivation techniques, and over the years, many other aspects of mycology. And all along the way, realized how important and fascinating the science is for many different reasons. And initially realized that none of my friends and peers shared that interest or had any point of connection to it. So after a few years of kind of struggling to share my excitement, I started developing dialogues and creative outlets with friends in different capacities to shift the way that I talked about fungi, the people close to me, and then eventually more and more people as sort of the word got out and sort of the effects of the work I was doing with others reached bigger audiences. And so now, 20-something years later, I'm still heavily invested in the world of mycology with a big emphasis on education and promotion, and also in many ways, as kind of since early on, building a culture of sorts around and creative outlets and cultural artifacts around the emerging modern era of human fungal relations. So everything about mycology is interesting. So depending on the day and the context and the person, I could talk about whatever we want to. But at the end of the day, it's all important to me.
Yeah. And in preparing for this, it became clear, I think, that there's just too much to talk about when it comes to fungi and all the possible ways of sort of relating to them and finding meaning in them. But I wanted to hone in on what you just raised, which is the myco-culture, which I think is a sort of pillar of your project to generate culture around appreciation for fungi, practical relationships with fungi. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to why that's important, like what you see as being a myco-culture that you hope to foster and how you do it.
Well, I I've always considered myself an artist before a scientist. I just have a bigger, longer standing background in creative outlets of various sorts. And so my original approach to mycology and sharing it with others was always from a kind of creative and more abstract approach, kind of thinking in like metaphoric terms and all these ways that fungi inspire. And that was my initial real big draw, as opposed to just the more right brain, practical nitty grittiness. Of course, nowadays I like to marry the two for all good reasons. But what I realized as I was kind of just saying my introduction is that, you know, nobody I knew, family, friends, peers, teachers really at any level knew anything about fungi, cared about them. And I eventually realized it's because we have no cultural context. We don't see them promoted in any form in almost any movies. There's a couple that I like to talk about, but pretty much they're absent. They're not in music. They're not in pop culture, right? In any significant way, especially, you know, take off last couple of years. We go back, there's just totally absent from modern mainstream culture, pretty much anywhere in the world. Even though they're richly infused into human history. And so I sort of realized over the years there's this big disparity. And what you did have for sort of some sense of creative inlets to mycology, or another way to appreciate them beyond the can I eat it approach, was maybe, you know, some watercolors and just a few sort of pieces of art and things that didn't really move me. It wasn't really my aesthetic. And so that was something that just stood out to me. It's like, this is a cool thing. I had a lot of friends years ago that were, you know, really into plants, and there was a lot of sort of subculture and a lot of cool art relating around glorifying plants and making them look cool and showing how beautiful they are, but through illustration, for example, or other forms of art. And so I just started to apply that tactic to this passion and show, you know, mushrooms are interesting looking. And then it just sort of evolved from there to there's no culture. I mean, well, there is a culture, but there's no pillars of a culture really infused into mycology. If you look at the definition of what a culture is, the definition varies, but you're usually talking about a form of language, some sense of maybe spirituality or belief systems, ethics, morals, maybe language, maybe clothing styles, obviously forms of art, poetry, and all the forms of art, etc. And even, you know, sort of laws and rules and things, depending on again, how broad in scope you're looking at a culture and civilization. And, you know, 15 years ago, there really wasn't that. There was books on how to cultivate, really technical books, how to identify, very, you know, for good reason, scientific and narrow focus books. And that was pretty much it. And, you know, like I said, very little art. So for me, it's been a question of, you know, something resonates for me. This is cool. I think I'm a cool guy. How can I make this thing cool too? And with my friends, you know, just over the years, trying different things to show and create new expressions, means to express not just myself or those near me, but for other people to express their excitement. So we've done that. And I've been involved in, most recently, the world's first fungi film festival a couple of years ago, creating a mixtape that was, you know, had 30 plus artists from around the world submitting not just music, but creative audio pieces influenced by fungi. And then I've been involved in a biennial event called the Radical Mycology Convergence for over 10 years. That is, on one hand, focused on skills and whatnot, but since the first inception, at its core was always about building a culture and a community. At the time, destigmatizing what was very taboo, this notion that fungi are interesting, was very fringe. Nowadays, not so much of a challenge to get that point across. So we evolved the convergence every iteration to make it more culturally expressive. So the most recent one that we were able to hold in 2018, we skipped last year. We had a 30 plus international artist art show. Muralists from Mexico came up and painted this incredible mural. We had musicians playing full sets inspired by fungi, etc. So for me, this scratches two big itches for me, you know, being an artist of sorts and liking to be involved in all forms of arts. And then of course, mycology. And for me, it's just, you know, science and art go together. Science is just another way to be curious and creatively engaging in the world. You have to be creative to ask novel questions in science. And, you know, I think artists can be inspired by nature, of course, in so many ways. And there's many ways to blend all that you get from science into art, from the pigments to the subject matter. You know, of course, there's the classic thing that many people a couple hundred years ago practiced both sides of the brain, or they balanced both sides of the brain by studying the arts and sciences. And it's very much missing from our modern culture. And mycology offers such a rich means to blend the two, because so much of it's untapped, both in the science end of it, but also in the cultural development end of it.
Mm. Oh, so many directions I feel like I could go with all of that great stuff. But what jumps to mind for me is the cultivation of mushrooms themselves and how that's so much a part of the culture. And to me seems like a pretty rich area of intersection between the art and the science of it. I wonder if you could speak to, I mean, I think you sort of maybe early on in your media creation in this space, you were talking about how to cultivate mushrooms. Here's how, here's why, put these tools into people's hands. You had very, kind of famously in the myco scene, a video where you taught cigarette butts. I forget the species of fungus you used, but you taught a fungus to consume cigarette butts, and we're saying, look at the possibility in this method. I know that inspired me when I saw it. So I wonder, yeah, if you could speak to the role of cultivation itself in bridging that art science gap that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's we live in a really unprecedented era of ethnomycology or human fungal relationships, where we not only understand the importance of fungi in natural systems to a degree never before matched, largely thanks to advancements in a lot of technology and especially DNA work and things. And at the same time, we are able to cultivate fungi with greater ease, and especially mushrooms and fruit, relatively large quantities of mushrooms with greater ease than ever before in human history. And the marrying of those two new whole arenas of development and applied mycology leads to this vast unknown wild west of the future of fungi that we're rapidly like steamrolling into, that is filled with the realization for anybody that jumps on the train, or I guess the steamroller, is that there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot that these organisms can do uniquely. And if we work with them, they might be able to help us, and to, I don't think that, like you said in the beginning, I don't think they'll necessarily solve all our problems, but they're definitely a great tool, an incredible tool, and a very unique tool for the toolbox. And they have great application and unique applications that everything else on the planet can't match, because only fungi do it, So they have their place. It's just, unfortunately, most people don't know much about them because they might not have learned anything through their educational system, whatever that might have been, even private systems, and of course in public. And especially beyond just an introduction to what are fungi is, cultivation. I think most people, generally speaking, understand the notion of how to grow a tomato plant. You would either put a seed in the ground and you give some food, some water, and some sun, and then it goes up and hopefully you get a crop. But the notion of, and just the core concepts of how to grow mushrooms is very foreign to people. Again, it's so not only not taught in the schooling, but it's just absent from our culture. It's not a thing. You can't, there's how many towns have the local mushroom growing store like they have the local plant growing store? Very, very few in this continent and really in the world. And so that's just, this blind spot we have, generally speaking, with mycology, and then especially in the practicality and the benefits of growing gourmet edible mushrooms. And there's many benefits. There's the obvious, sort of free-ish food, cheaper food. Mushrooms are expensive in the store, so learn to do it yourself is great. There's the medicinal value that many people study and learn how to grow mushrooms just for the medicinal benefits, because the mushrooms work really well and when nothing else does. And then there's the sort of bigger picture approaches of, in nature, fungi are the loop closers. They're great recyclers, and we can take many of the waste streams we produce in agricultural systems that don't have a good end or upcycled, next phase, say feed it to animals, or, you can put it in the compost pile maybe, but really a lot of the streams that we can't really do something additional with are great substrates, growing medium for mushrooms. So one of the best examples I always like to use is, say, coffee bean hulls or husks, which are really, bad for ruminants and bad for animals to digest, not good for them. But you can grow mushrooms on them. It breaks down the acids that are disruptive to the animal's digestion. You get a crop of mushrooms, and now the material is actually protein rich thanks to the mycelium. And now you can feed it to the animal, or you can put it into your compost. So you kind of just get this extra output from something you already have, with just a little bit extra work, but you can justify that for many different reasons, even economic ones. But again, just on the personal scale, there's a lot of benefits. For me, mushroom growing nowadays, especially thanks to many, many people, the giants whose shoulders I largely stand on, who developed all the DIY home kitchen hacks. Mushroom cultivation is just another fermentation hobby, if you want it to be, alongside high quality beer brewing, or sort of moderate quality beer brewing. You can mess up a couple times, you decide how much you want to invest in the equipment, but you can get a pretty good outcome with a little bit of diligence and getting over the hurdles. And then it's smooth sailing, and you can do it while you're making dinner or while you're drinking one or eating a mushroom dish you just made. And we're really at that point. And again, it's a new concept of human history. We've been domesticating plants for 10,000 plus years. We really only, domesticated mushroom cultivation, made it accessible and consistent about 100 years ago. And really in the kitchen scale, depending how you slice it, in my mind, the better approach is maybe 10 years ago. So for folks that are new to this, that's why it's not familiar to you. It's totally novel and new in human history, but the prospects are many.
Yeah. Again, a million directions I could go, but it just causes me to think about how much, when I first started to learn about mushroom cultivation, and in so doing, learning about how mycelium works, how fungi work, and through that, the roles they play in ecosystems, observing a being that is all around us and is ubiquitous and essential, but invisible largely, except for their reproductive organs, and which is really the way that most people conceive of and relate to fungi. But I've become fond of just sort of pointing out to people that, like, if you stepped into the woods and removed the plants from the picture or the animals from the picture, you would really feel like you were missing part of what made that space a forest. And fungi is just as relevant. It's just not quite as visible a dimension of the living world. And so I feel like maybe, and I'd be curious if you agree or disagree with this, but that, like, learning to work with fungi, which I think is a term that's kind of used instead of like using fungi or studying. I feel like people are trying to really watch their language about how they enter these new relationships that we're forming with this kingdom of life, or queendom of life, or queerdom, or kindom of life, as some people like to call it. It has implications that go beyond just food, medicine, huge as those are. Like, those are already huge areas of activity to try to stimulate and improve for people. But I feel like it leads to a greater awareness and perspective without even the need for psychedelic, experiences, which I would also note, there's a thread of legacy from psychedelic tradition in cultivation that is still alive today through the cultivation of these medicinal and culinary mushrooms. I think that's maybe the closest thing to like a fungal culture that we have in the West at this point, is a kind of extracted tradition from a certain part of the world that led to a lot of these technological innovations among people who wanted to cultivate magic mushrooms, although all mushrooms are magic, in their basements and in their closets. And now that's leading to whole new industries popping up. And obviously, as psilocybin is legalized or decriminalized, it's going to create a whole new space of activity where these techniques are going to gain new levels of sophistication and scale. So that's a lot. It's plugged into some pretty broad themes, but I wanted to just pull back from that and ask you to maybe unpack a little bit more this like new age you're talking about. I think you put it to me as the fourth wave of ethnomycology. And I wonder if you could give us a quick tour of those stages as you see them.
Well, the initial being the biggest, and that's the broad history of traditional cultures working with fungi and macro and micro species influencing the development of human culture in direct and many indirect ways. And that's definitely going to be the biggest, but still is being written because there's actually so little that has been documented, investigated, or considered by anthropologists and scholars of the past, considering the development of a culture, a human culture, and how the fungi influenced them just as the plants and animals did, and how they were infused in ritual tradition as well as obviously custom and healing practices. We have some documentation here and there, but I would certainly bet that there's much that has yet to be really understood. So that goes at least as far back, it can go back as far as you want, because fungi, arguably the models basically point to fungi having developed, or fungal-like organisms having developed after bacteria. And that implies plants and animals descended from fungi. So, what does that mean to you? Regardless, when hominids started developing and Homo sapiens sapiens developed, we were eating plants that were coated in beneficial and somewhat medicinal yeast. So they've always been a part of our diet. All wild plants are infused with fungi that are inoculum for our microbiome, our internal flora and ecology. of other microbes, but also fungi that are beneficial, it seems, to our immune system and other aspects of our health, including mental health. So they've always been a part of the human body. Again, just, we only realized that just recently. But we flash forward, I guess, and there's many ways that traditional cultures have used mushrooms, lichens, molds, and yeast to venerate the natural world and the gods, and whatever way that they chose to live or developed to live in the world. And then a lot of that was eventually finally distilled, or at least the practical identification aspect of it, around 250 years ago, when mycology was solidified as a more formal science. And then for about 200 years, you had a very small number relative to the other sciences, number of researchers documenting the fungi of the world, classifying them, taking a very analytical approach to understanding and sorting out all the species that are out there. Very important foundational work, but that laid the foundation of traditional mycology, or at least I like to call it. And then in the mid 20th century, as you were just speaking to, there was a big cultural shift, especially in the West, towards this sort of reintegration of fungi into the way that Westerners live. Now, mushrooms especially have been a big part of Eastern traditions, and it's never really gone away. It's some of our oldest documentation comes out of China and other parts of Asia. And mushrooms as food and medicine especially have always been a significant portion of the diet and health practices there. So I speak more of the West in these respects. But of course, this was in the sort of early ages and stages of the psychedelic revolution, as many call it, the reintroduction, or really the promotion of especially psilocybin-containing mushrooms in the 50s and 60s, and then their development through improved cultivation practices throughout the second half of the 20th century, which is where so much emphasis was put. Pretty much beyond that, all you had was maybe portobellos and creminis, which don't taste very good. And that's, you had these two perspectives, especially in North America and really in Europe too, especially Western Europe, that mushrooms are either, this thing that'll change how you perceive reality, or they're like a cold thing that you slice onto your salad. And thanks to the internet, and again, as I said a little bit ago, modern technology, we've developed all these new means of engaging with and working with fungi in just recent years. And I see that as the shift now into this fourth era. And it's going to be, who knows when another major shift will change, but I perceive it as being a very, very long path ahead of us to continue to develop, and probably many roads, will be branched off of that. But it's an exciting, new, like I say, Wild West that is unlike these other three areas that laid the way.
Yeah, and on that road, I think many intersections too are appearing. I'm thinking of something I've seen in my travels a lot, is the intersection of permaculture principles, and you even alluded to it, I think, in some of the terms you used, like closing loops. It feels like fungi fill a piece of the perspective on how to build reciprocal circular systems, and offer some practical means for doing that. There's also interesting intersections with alchemy and the other kind of fringe or obscure kind of subcultures, but it feels like fungi have some way of kind of tying them all together, maybe appropriate given the way that they behave. And I guess I kind of wanted to explore that a bit with you, the mycelial metaphor. I remember when we were discussing one of the RMC, I think it was the 2018 RMC, how half jokingly mycelium was sort of consulted, or you asked among the organizers, like, how would a mycelium distribute the porta potties or the lunch tables, or I forget, some bit of infrastructure, and there was a mycelial like lens through which you were assessing the situation. So I guess that's more of a prompt. Can you tell me, what is it possible that the mycelial metaphor is as endlessly useful as it seems, or is it kind of reductive?
I think it's just another great way to learn from fungi. I mean, they sort of teach us many things, just as you can learn from, your house pets, your lap dog, how to be happy or something, right? I mean, there's just all the elements in the natural world have something different to show us and teach us that's unique. Other humans have things to show us, right? So why not these other really ancient and resilient and unusual and incredible organisms have something unique for us to take in through observation and contemplation, to whatever depth you feel so called. And for many, the inspiration comes not so much from the fruit body, the mushroom that we can appreciate for all its diversity and allure, but the hidden aspect, the mycelium that's infused throughout the natural world. Through almost every living thing in the world is infused with fungi to some degree, and it's doing a lot of important things that nothing else does. And what is there to learn from the success of that organism that we could mirror as humans that have seemed to lost our way and have diverged from a resilient, successful, and sustainable path? And so, you get this in traditional cultures where, depending on the people, they might talk about, this animal teaches this and this thing teaches that. This is just a different approach, I think, to that type of mentality of respecting the intelligence of nature and the evolutionary knowledge that's built through 3 billion years of fungal evolution, and what is there to be gleaned from that, even on just a sort of practical, sort of almost apples to apples comparison. So the first one that caught me 20 years ago, well, 15 years ago, that many people I think understand pretty easily, is that the nettedness of mycelium is a great metaphor for human societies where everything's kind of connected and everything weaves together: resources, knowledge, information, communication, thoughts, memes, etc. You take that to the internet too, as a more kind of global information system. And how does that mirror how mycelium operates? Well, I like to think about this more human element. And if we talk about, say, a culture, whatever that phrase is, maybe subculture of the music scene you're into, or it's the nation state you're involved in, or the bioregion, where I'm in, where sort of talk about the Pacific Northwest as a certain vibe. I don't know, but it's something you're tied to, something I'm tied to, is where I've come from, what I've evolved out of. But I'm just like in the mycelial web, there's millions of individual filaments, individual hyphae, and it's kind of like each human is like an individual hyphae, where each individual thread at its tip has its own sort of autonomy, and it has actually a little unique structure called a Spitzenkorper that's much like a brain of some sorts, and it's living in its own little world, doing its own little thing in direct response to its immediate environment, which it is learning from and responding to very dynamically in every moment, and yet also feeding that information and effect back to the greater culture to support and influence the greater culture. And are we not doing that unless we're a hermit or something? And so there's a very direct relationship. So it's like, okay, we're sort of similar this way. How is it doing it in a way that's really successful and really beneficial, not just to itself but to the entire ecosystem? And how can we mirror that? And you could pick that apart a lot of ways where that just gets in a little bit more of the nitty gritty. But there's a lot of great examples. One of my favorites is in the realm of mycoremediation. There's this reality that a lot of fungi, molds, mushrooms, even microfungi, when they encounter a toxin that they've never encountered before, if given enough time, they will sort of quickly adapt, if you will, and figure out how to eat that thing. Because like, eat or die, you got to get food out of it, or let it consume you, or hurt you. And very often, especially many mushrooms, are really good at adapting and eating this thing that arguably Earth has never seen before humans invented it. So how do they do that? Well, I don't know. They got a lot of genetic magic going on. But, sort of more abstractly, they're sort of pulling knowledge from within. And they're pulling from a genetic database of, so many genes that are inactivated. They activate the right one to produce the right exudate that does the job. Well, let's take that to a more abstract level. I reach a challenge. Yesterday was stressful. Tomorrow might just be worse. But you got to keep growing forward, and you can't really ever grow back, and you're going to hit challenges that you don't anticipate. So you either let it overwhelm you and you decay, or you find an inner strength and an inner will to overcome, or to unpack and resolve that challenge. So it's a nice point of inspiration. And again, that inspiration is a little bit harder to grasp because they're not nice and cuddly like a big soft animal, and they're not something you can wrap your arms around so much like a tree. They're this other organism that's a little bit more removed from our interaction with. So it's like our relationship almost has to be, especially on the mycelial level, more of a mental connection. And so it's not for everybody per se, but I think there is a lot to glean from that if you just meditate with it a good bit.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that last part up in particular, because I feel like, I find myself trying to emphasize to people, and it already came up in our conversation here, how this is a massive dimension of the natural world that's overlooked, ignored, maligned, fought against viciously by our species. We really hate mold, and sometimes it's a good thing to be careful about mold. It can cause a lot of problems, and fungi can be opportunists just like any other living thing. But I think also just like any plant or any animal, it's possible to find meaningful relationships and communion with this dimension of the natural world. And maybe it involves some more abstract methods or techniques or ways of thinking, but I would have to think that would benefit us as a species to be more acculturated to thinking that way and to finding dignity and agency in every dimension of the natural world, especially those that we come to realize that we've been ignoring and that are important and that have so much to offer us in partnership. But that's my own little screed. And I think also it's partly why maybe there's so much, radical mycology is a term that sort of, for me, has conveniently summed up this marriage of like social issues and consciousness with ecological consciousness, a desire to protect and uplift, every member of both, and also to keep fungi as the sort of organizing principle or inspiration, point of inspiration, even if the work goes well outside of fungi. So I just wanted to get all that out of my head, because I think it's really fascinating how fungi can inspire conversations that go so far beyond themselves. And but when you start to think about how much inspiration we get from other aspects of the natural world, it's really not all that surprising. I did want to jump back a bit, though, to what you were talking about as far as applied mycology and developing working relationships that actually pertain to some of the problems we hope to see solved in the world. And it's an area that you're very specialized in. You know a lot about myco-remediation. And for those who don't know in the audience what that is, it's this fast growing, very promising field of working with fungi or studying fungi, or if you please, using fungi to clean up contaminants in soils, heavy metals, to break down certain contaminants. Maybe it's a hydrocarbon, something from oil, plastics. There's a lot of promise and hope in that space, but I think there's also a lot of hype and overstating. And I think that maybe the real solutions kind of come down to changing our perspectives in some of those ways you were talking about. Like, how do we observe fungi in nature? What are they doing? Well, they're not degrading the basis of their ecosystems and their neighbors for the sake of their own enrichment. Something we can learn from. But I wonder if that's just as relevant in approaching myco-remediation techniques and other applied mycology conversations, every bit as much as like learning to cultivate the right strain, or finding a new species that creates some exciting new exudate. Is that a balance you agree with?
I mean, observation is first step, and learning from, it's that simple. It's one of the core principles of permaculture as a design philosophy and system of observing and moving slowly. Fungi are a great reflection of that. They move fairly slowly, but they have profound effect when they choose to, and just as we can, and we have a lot of influence with our opposable thumbs. So, how we choose to flex them is an important choice every moment. When it comes to remediation, a lot of the excitement around it I learned years ago, being somewhat guilty of this initially, was a lack of full understanding of the scope and limitations of this really powerful skill set. But it is, one that is biologically based and inherently constrained. And so when you don't really fully understand, again, just the basics of fungal biology, how fungi grow, what they need to live, and how easily they can die, and then beyond that, how to cultivate them and what that takes, and how sensitive some species can be, and then beyond that, how to design a scientific experiment to treat toxic chemicals and be cautious around all that, and do good analytics. Those are layers of training that are, in my biased opinion, not too difficult to overcome, but it takes time and some practice. But without that, even that foundational level of just what are fungi, what defines, and how does mycelium grow, it's very easy to just kind of hear the most exciting tips of this massive topic and sort of just grab on them, and then it's sort of take it, where your imagination might wish it could go. And so, again, I did that a little bit early on, and pretty quickly I was like, oh, I need to hone in and get my facts straight as an educator and make sure I'm not, slicing things up too much or at all. And it comes back to just what I said, just understanding that especially as cultivation has really helped that. It's like, okay, they can do this, but they really can't do this? And even if they can do this thing fairly okay, what is the reality in the real world outside of the lab bench where most of the research has been? You know, it's one thing to grow a mushroom on a chemical and a controlled environment. It's another thing to throw them into a landfill and let them run wild, or try and hope that they even grow there. So there's prospects and potentials, but then there's the best approach and best practice. And there is a good middle ground between the two. And it's a lot of what I've tried to, understand and wrap my head around when I got into micromediation, teaching myself more about it, because there was nowhere to study it. I mean, I was just reading technical papers and really technical literature for many years, and with, no mentors, and then practicing it. You realize that, there's a lot of data, most of it's lab based. And then it's a lot of my work has been for myself, my personal benefit, but then by extension, the benefit of others, to translate all this technical stuff into, okay, what does that actually mean? If we're just having a conversation about it, I can explain to you, in just a few paragraphs or, a few minutes or whatever, what micromediation is, how it boils down, what are the real, in my mind, what are the most practical, lowest hanging fruit body applications to tackling it. And then we can actually talk about, okay, then let's start there, and how could we roll that out, and what does it look like? And there is a lot of potential there. Just unfortunately, it's the lack of training. It's one of the chapters of my book I spent the most time on, was just the incredible amount of confusion and complexity and the discussion around micromediation in the technical literature, and translating that to something that a layperson could understand, I would hope. And at the end of it, doing all that work and thinking it through, it is very clear that there's a number of things that fungi are profound and powerful at remedying, when it comes to not just pollution, breakdown and cleaning up that, but also help rehabilitating and regenerating damaged and disturbed habitats. And fungi play, really powerful roles in both. But again, a lot of my personal awareness and sort of being able to wrap my head around it all came from an observation, a relationship with fungi, largely through cultivation, through observation in nature too, but also just through the cultivation is really a powerful tool for understanding, the needs of these organisms, as I say, and how to take care of them.
And that reminds me to encourage anybody, if you're listening and you're you're curious about learning more about fungi, one of the best ways, in my opinion, to do that is to, if you're starting at square zero, is to get like a grow it at home kit. There's probably a cultivator near you who's providing kits of shiitake mushrooms or oyster mushrooms. And it's almost as simple as, it really is just as simple as add water in a lot of cases. And it is an immense education in a form of life that we just don't get a lot of exposure to. And in fact, we're taught to avoid, as we've alluded to. The term mycophobia is used freely among mycophiles, because they recognize the change that has happened within them compared to the status quo. And I guess I was hoping to unpack a bit about the education piece and how critical that seems to be, based on what I've seen. I've only really been in this world for the last 6 or 7 years, in this world, a fan of fungi. And you've been at this a lot longer. Even in the short amount of time I've been doing this, I've noticed a definite change in attitudes toward fungi. I've noticed that there's a lot less ew and ick and kind of reactions I get from people when I talk to them about fungi, or tell them I'm into it. And there's genuine curiosity. I think we're seeing a lot of evidence of that. And I wonder how much of that is just down to literacy, in your view, myco-literacy and education. And I guess that's also an essential part of building culture, isn't it?
Well, it's critical. That was the initial work with Radical Mycology, the Radical Mycology convergence in many ways, and some stuff before that was shifting the dialogue. A lot of that is through language. So I've been a writer. I used to be a underground rapper, so I'm like super into words, and my whole life, big talker. And I don't know. It's a lot of philosophers have talked about the importance of language, and 1984, right? If we don't have language, we can't understand or think about the world. We don't have words to express our feelings, and so words are super important. And that was a lot of the initial work through Radical Mycology convergence. How do we have new phrases? And it was like being really funny and tongue-in-cheek, like you're saying about it all. But it was to break down these cultural barriers. Early on, I learned not to tell people, or chose not to tell people when they asked what I do or whatnot, that I do things with mushrooms, because the word mushroom, especially at the time, had so much baggage. And so I gravitated towards saying, I I teach about mycology, or I practice applied mycology. I work with fungi. People are like, what does that mean? And it's like, okay, well, what do you do? Blah, blah, blah. Well, a mold does this thing in your reality. And it's like, what? And then you're kind of just totally catching them off guard in a good way to open up space instead of saying, oh, mushrooms are like, psychedelics, right? Or, portobellos, and they just very narrow perspective. And so you broaden the language through simple terms like that. And now, as we've sort of mentioned, over the years, there's been just a broadening of phrases and catchphrases and terms and sort of inner lingo. In the world of cultivation, there's a lot of acronyms and sort of slang there as well. But even just in the general, new generation of people being excited about fungi, there is some, again, some sort of slang, and it's something I'm interested in and have tried to add here and there some of the phraseology that I have chosen to use, which at the time did not roll off the tongue easily because it was the first time I'd ever heard it, but now makes a lot more sense. I prefer to say myceliate instead of colonize when in cultivation due to the cultural baggage related to that. Even though scientifically it's accurate or whatever, it's just, I don't know, why not call it myceliate? Yeah. And so we can expand that to any dimension and any aspect of culture, and how do you meet somebody where they're at with whatever they think is important in reality, and at least introduce the notion that, hey, there's this thing out there that's available if you're interested. Just as gardening in your backyard could be your thing, but maybe you work down at you're a car mechanic and it's just not your thing, but it's out there if you wanted to pick it up on the weekends. And it's the same thing here with every aspect of mushroom growing, whether it's the cultivation, whether it's getting into nature and doing a walking meditation that some might call mushroom foraging, and being in a space with an intention and a relationship that is different than one you might have been told is the only one possible in that space or in that time of your life or place of your life. And so this is again, for example, that's why we did the how the Radical Mycology convergence has evolved to try to make new spaces, new sort of openings for people to come in and add their own contribution to it. For me, the phrase Radical Mycology from the get-go was never meant to be a specific thing. I've always said that. For me, it was, a notion that I had, a sort of philosophy, for lack of a better word, a way of seeing not just mycology, which we could go there, but it's really through that mycelial lens, seeing the world in a different way, and maybe even beyond extension, shifting up your perception of this one thing, thereby shifting up your perception of the world, thereby shifting up your belief systems in general, and having you question, what you've been taught. You've been told mushrooms are bad your whole life, and actually they're amazing. Maybe I was told something else when I was young and I just believed it and never questioned it again. For all these reasons, mycology is a really powerful tool for cultural shifting, because luckily it is so unexplored. It's sort of this a bummer that it's such a neglected mega science, but it's also pretty radical that it's wide open for interpretation. And so I've never really wanted to be one to say it has to be this way and the future fungi is this. I got my own thing going on. I got my own sort of thing I'll do, sure, but I've always been excited about especially the next generation. I think what me and my peers and your work is doing right now is really just helping further just crush all this stigma and taboo-ness that's totally unnecessary for one of the largest branches on the tree of life and one of the most important players in the natural world and even the human world, and paving the way for there's no barriers to discussion, and the education is being brought into public systems, slowly but surely in more recent years. And what's it going to look like in 10, 20, 30 is unknown to me, and I think to anybody. So I don't know if that really, I forget what your original question was, but that's where I went with it.
It took us in a great direction, and I think it answered it lovely. It also inspired me to remember that, my own image of the mycelial metaphor and the vernacular is changing as it changes my way of thinking. So just made me realize that I used to think of this book as a kind of, as my mushroom in a way, like the result of all of the connections I had made and all the influences I had drawn up. And here's my effort at spreading the spores from that. And these are terms that we hear a lot in daily life, probably more than most people. But I've also started to come to think of what we do and what I've tried to do with this book, for instance, as creating substrate, or as providing substrate, so that whatever spore might land, or wherever a person might be when they meet it, the right reaction will happen and the right next step will take place. And I think that there are many levels to that way of thinking. And I think we're also heading to the Q&A section of our
Yeah, we're
chat.
right at 7:45-ish, and there are about 9 questions in both the chat and the Q&A. So I will just dive right in if you guys
All
are
right.
all set for that.
Thank you.
So Andrea says, how can fungi help us face our problems? How can fungi help with biological remediation and or mitigate climate change? Can you recommend any scientific papers to reference?
I mean, I think we each have books that kind of get at that, you know, that provide a lot of answers to that. I'm not sure if you would want to jump off on that one, Peter. I mean, it's basically how can mushrooms save the world, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways that fungi offer unique tools and applications to improve our personal station and collective station in the world. Specifically say climate change, because that was a more specific question. The role that fungi perhaps most notably play in my mind for mitigating shifting, say, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere is the influences root associating fungi, what are known as mycorrhizal fungi, have on depositing carbon into the soil. So of course the plants take in the carbon, turn it into sugar through photosynthesis, but that very quickly, a lot of that goes to its roots to feed the soil food web. And a lot of that is spread into the soil food web via mycelium to build mycelium, which then deposits, decays, feeds other things, and also through the exudates released by the mycelium to feed the food web and become what we call carbon sinks and sort of deposits. It's long-term soil carbon storage. A significant portion, somewhere in the order of a third of the world's carbon storage, has been approximated to actually be a result of fungal growth, if not tissue exudate. And so more fungi is an easy bumper sticker to point towards, because they do a lot of good things. There's some fungi that, you know, you got to be careful with and things, but by and large, we've disturbed soil systems so much, and we've not tracked the influences of fungi pretty much throughout all of human history, the negative effects we've had. And so I think it's a safe proposition to say better practices of the future are going to put fungi first and to consider them as a foundational layer and bedrock, keystone players of an ecosystem, and to always incorporate them into any design to make it more resilient against a warming planet, a changing climate, or any other future impact, whatever that might be.
I
can't do better than that.
That was pretty good.
I've gotten that question before, so.
Boilerplate answer then. What are some of the primary major challenges facing the integration of fungi within popular culture and education?
I hate to keep passing this off to you, Peter. I mean, that's your bailiwick. I would just contribute that I think, as we've alluded to, there's a major cultural resistance, just an embedded kind of association, certainly in the English-speaking world, with fungi as agents of death and decay, as though those are bad things. And I feel like we're starting to overcome that. But yeah, how would you answer that, Peter?
Well, I think it's from the way that I flow is in as much as I can, not really put force my agenda down somebody else's throat. So you might personally be excited about mycology because for this reason or that, and that might not necessarily be what grabs the next person. And so if you're trying to push that thing, it might actually be like, I don't know. And so as I mentioned before, what I've sort of figured out over years is trying to understand where people are at, trying to meet them there, or try to introduce how mycology influences their thing. And so it's something that it makes them care about it. They have a reason to care about it. The big problem with the history of mycology, traditional mycology, is there was no emotional connection to it. There was no, this is what motivates people. We like to think we're logical people, but we're mostly driven by our emotions. And so art is a good means to stir the emotions. And so in all the forms of art. And so something that gives you a deep, personal, emotional, heart-pulling relationship on whatever level to this otherwise traditionally presented very sterile, cold, and relatively boring science is going to be for the benefit of the culture. So that's why for me, it's in as much as I've tried to do my little bits here and there, I'm much more excited to see all the ways that people get creative in their approach. We get a lot of mushroom art, art with mushroom on your face, and that's cool. I think there's a lot more to be done to appreciate fungi. The Fungi Film Fest exemplified all the many ways to take inspiration. Fungi is a starting point of inspiration and through the medium of film, which is so powerful, express it in many different ways. And yeah, but anybody listening, you know, I encourage you to find your own avenue.
Great. So what happened 10 years ago that changed the history of cultivation?
Well,
I think you researched this, Doug. I mean,
maybe I can answer this one. Well, there were, I think, a symphony of developments that you know, the internet obviously created a substrate, a basis for communities to form around how do we grow this psychedelic mushroom. It was that simple. And all sorts of methods were tried and iterated, and it's actually a really great example of community you know, engagement and innovation. It's sort of like a Reddit for psychedelic technology, or tech, TEK is what they tend to call it. And so, I mean, squarely 10 years ago, I don't know if I would put any kind of revolutionary, you know, point exactly that date, but I know, and Peter can also speak to this, the development of things like the airport tech for jar cultivation, which made it possible to inoculate grains or other substrates without having to go through a whole involved sterilization process. You could just do it with a syringe. And I think the upshot of that is that people can grow lots of mushrooms of high quality, high yield, of all sorts, because people are also learning how to work with different species now that they couldn't cultivate before, using different kinds of substrates. And that made it possible to basically imagine anything you wanted to do with fungi, with mycelium or their mushrooms of all sorts of species, and to experiment. And I think Peter's work and people like William Padilla Brown and you know, the list will go on, of people who are expanding this space, are like Peter alluded to, like building on the work of closet innovators, you know, and online anonymous tinkerers who made I also, if anyone's curious about that history, I would commend Joanna Steinhardt's work documenting what she has described as DIY mycology, with a focus on the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest, and the tie between the modern cultivation techniques and these psychedelic tech innovations of the last 20 and 30 years. I hope that answers the question.
I think
is there more? You could fill in the gaps there, maybe.
Well, I said 10 years because of the airport development. I mean, it's again, the details kind of a lot to get into, but it as Doug said, it changed the game. And it changed the game for me, learning that you had to grow this really overly complicated and really demanding and intimidating approach to you can do it while you're making dinner right in the kitchen, down and dirty. I encourage you to look it up. It's something we call just like liquid culture, mushroom growing. There's a whole wealth of resources to tap into there.
Incidentally, mycotopia is one of those those forums, and so is shroomery.org. These are the sort of mainstay. There are others, but they aren't coming to mind right now.
Great. What is the possibility in urban gardens and public parks?
Just from what I've heard from people working in those spaces and landscaping with fungi, I mean, it's a great way to foster the health of the plants, to create soils that are ecosystemically operating, and to maybe add some value to what you're pulling from the garden as well, in the form of mushrooms. I mean, those are sort of the first blush benefits of it to me. What do you think?
I mean, it's one of these areas of land tending and food production that, again, is just in need of great development and iteration, both on the macro and micro fungal level. So we have the mushrooms that we can infuse as, you know, inoculated logs, as ornamentation, and somewhat of like water retention structures and infrastructure in a garden setting, depending on the scale. You can have like mushroom garden beds. This is pretty easy and great introductory techniques, but there's also, I think, more foundationally the better practice, increasing the commonality of the infusion of micro and mycorrhizal fungi into soil systems and composting practices in a very directed and proven way. right now. We have some pretty good research, and certain species are better studied than others. There's a whole lot we don't understand about soils in general, but especially the soil fungi and ways that we can better cultivate them and incorporate them to increase plant health, reduce pathogenic organisms, root rot and things, while building up nutrient reserves and just increasing nutrient cycling along with the other soil food web players. Fungi are just, they're key component of a healthy soil system, ecosystem. And if we're trying to create something like that in our backyards or whatnot, we always want to consider them.
Okay. Is there a hydroponics application for fungi?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, they require more than just nutrified water, although that might not be true because I'm thinking of liquid culture, and that's essentially what that is, right? Do you know of any hydroponic applications for fungi?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I've gotten it before, and you're right. So in the liquid culture technique, you're typically most kind of small scale growers are growing mycelium in a broth of really simple sugar water, and maybe a little bit of protein's been added. That's about it. Sort of the core elements of growth. Some species will grow and fruit little layer mushrooms right on that if you let them sit long enough. So it kind of speaks to their strength and things. But a lot of species won't because they're not getting the full diet that they need. A lot of mushrooms, a lot of the more gourmet and medicinal mushrooms need to grow on wood to produce fruit bodies. There are precursor compounds and molecules in the wood that they require to form their fruit bodies. So it has to be growing off of wood. Now, could you provide those through a supplemented, hydroponic type system? Potentially. Those nutrients are not at your plant growing store because fungi aren't plants. They don't eat the same food that plants eat. They don't eat the same way that plants eat. Plant roots are essentially sponges. Plant roots have evolved to anchor a plant, stabilize it, and serve as a beacon and host for all the organisms that actually do the chemical transformations in the soil to bring nutrients to them. In the absence of those organisms, we as humans provide water-soluble nutrients that the plant roots just sponge up in lieu of organisms. So fungi want to actively digest their food. They want to grow on it, provide the right suite of enzymes to break it down, digest externally, create just the right byproducts, and absorb just the things that they want. Very different. So you can always, I'm always keen on experimentation and blowing my mind by have my mind blown by somebody that did something that you're, not supposed to, but you have to go into it with that essential understanding that fungi aren't plants and they have different needs.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more. What are your thoughts on mycology being pulled into environmental policy protection and prevention, a culture of doing no harm instead of allowable harm that exists today? How can restoration and micromediation be successful while polluters are still allowed to pollute and capitalism continues? How are you seeing Indigenous Frontline impacted communities intersecting with this work?
I love that question. And I'm also so happy to see who asked it. Beata, hi. She is in the book in a chapter about, and also has worked with Peter around issues of contaminated land in New Mexico around Espanola. That's near Los Alamos and Los Alamos Weapons Lab. It's a story worth reading. That's why it's in the book. And it speaks to something that I was really hoping to address in how I wrote this book and how I approached the subject, because we're talking about North America or Turtle Island. We're talking about a place that's been colonized, and a lot of these problems that we're trying to, that we're hoping to see addressed with fungi are happening in a context of harm and exploitation and extraction that, mushrooms are not really equipped to solve on their own. And so, I think there are layers to that question, and probably more than I'm able to fully unpack here. But I think to start at the end, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that is the truth, and that we're doing this all on stolen land, and that is something I've seen percolating into the conversations in mycological spaces. And I really wanted to highlight that in the book, because to me it's a sign that all of these bigger picture perspectives and all of this highfalutin talk about being connected and living sustainably and reciprocally, like, there are communities that for millennia did that here. They're still here, and we can they need to be part of that conversation, and they should probably be leading that conversation. And I saw that Mario of POC Fungi community is in the audience too, and they are doing vital work to create spaces where mycology is sort of the cause for building community and resilience in those communities. So long way of saying, my hope is that fungi are creating, whether through novel economic models and the chance to build local economies and to grow food and medicine for oneself and one's community, to remediate land, which is a subject that has special weight when talking about communities of color because of environmental racism and the fact that they live closer to contaminated sites on a highly elevated basis, just by dint of ethnicity in this country. This is all in the book, and I'm feeling like I'm trying to retell the whole book right now, but it's something I'm passionate about. I think that making that central to the conversation is key, and I'm really inspired that somehow fungi are helping or playing a role in fostering those conversations. So that's something I want to encourage. I don't think we can fix these problems without addressing capitalism, without addressing the extractive systems that, like we alluded to at the beginning, render any innovation, any development that we come across or come up with basically irrelevant, because it's all going to redound to the benefit of the same people as every other benefit that's been invented in the last few centuries. So that's my long answer to that question that could be 100 times longer, but I really appreciate it being raised here. I don't know, Peter, if you want to jump on that or not, but that's my my 2 cents on it.
No, I mean, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, maybe just a short one to end it. What's your favorite edible mushroom and why? We'll let both of you answer it.
Mine's boring. It's shiitake. I just love shiitake mushrooms. I had the chance to try some that were grown on like native woods with strains that were cultivated here, as far as I know. Although I don't know the real provenance of the strain, but I had some like really good shiitake, and it was maybe one of the most satisfying flavors I've ever experienced.
Fair enough. Probably my favorite would be wild maitake. We don't get it out here. It's not on the western side of the continent, so it's a specialty, the wild form especially. Yeah, pretty incredible. Never had it. My favorite favorite mushroom though overall would be probably, it's toe to toe, the amadou mushroom for its cultural significance, and then turkey tail for its for many benefits it offers, including medicinal and remediative.
Well, this was really fun. Thank you guys for your time tonight, and everyone for watching and joining us. There are links in the chat if you're interested in buying either of the books, and excited to see what you guys do next.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining me. This was such a joy for me.
Yeah. As we thought, the time just kind of flew by, but yeah, this is great. Thanks everyone.
All right, thank you.